Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I want to talk about, I'm making a video just talking about Barry Berkman as a character. Barry Berkman being the lead and title character from the TV show Barry. This will be a spoiler video, so if you've not seen the entirety of Barry, do not watch this video because, like I said, going into heavy spoilers. But I wanted to talk about Barry as a character because I think it's so interesting how, that story arc for that character and just characterization in general of half that show I feel like makes Barry, for the most part, I feel like half the show makes Barry seem sympathetic because he's a victim of not necessarily circumstances, but also somewhat circumstances, but also manipulation, but also a product of kind of who he really is. Because a lot of the show is kind of like, okay, well, he already starts off as a crappy person because he's a hitman, but it's about a story of, you know, wanting to redefine yourself. It's like, I don't want to be this person anymore. That we see that Barry can be a good person. We've seen it time and time again, especially season 1 and 2. He can be a good person, but the fact is he's kind of so messed up that allows someone like Fuchs to manipulate him. I mean, as we've seen, Fuchs has known Barry since he was a kid, so it was very predatory of, oh, let me take advantage of this person that I knew since they were a kid. And we don't know what Fuchs and Barry's relationship really was like, aside from like when they met when Barry was a kid versus, and like, right, Fuchs is the one that got Barry out of like that German hospital he was in post the whole Albert situation. So other than that, we don't really know their relationship before like Barry became a hitman, but for him to feel comfortable enough to send Barry down that route, it's like, does that say more about Barry or does that say more about Fuchs? It says enough about Barry that he was okay with being guided down that route, that he was broken enough to be in that position. I mean, to be fair, Fuchs came to him when he was broken, when it seemed like he was alone. Fuchs is the one that got him out, gave him purpose again, so he was lost, and so kind of like a cult leader, he was able to kind of cultivate that and push Barry down the route he wanted it to. Once again, Fuchs is a terrible person for doing this to someone that was like a nephew of sorts to him, that even eventually was kind of like, yo, you're kind of like a son to me. It is all kinds of messed up in that regard, but it also comes down to that situation of personal responsibility of Barry should have walked away at any point in time. It's like, I mean, years into like him doing the whole hitman thing, it's when he decides to call it quits, you know? It's because he found this new thing, this new lease on life. He was kind of getting bored with his 9-to-5 job as a hitman that, you know, it started weighing on him, which, I mean, hey, that shows that he has enough of a conscience that it started to weigh on him. But with everything that went down over the course of the show, he started losing himself more and more, and that conscience of his started disappearing. He didn't realize how more and more unhinged he was becoming. I mean, by the end of the show, like, Barry is super unhinged, and his trying to overcorrect, you know, doesn't do anything when he is as messed up as he is. I mean, going on a run with your family is one thing, like he was doing in the final season, but to get to that point that, like, he's trying to, he built his family life to overcompensate for all the terrible stuff he had done for years. It's like, well, you're trying to be low-key, sure, but, like, quoting Abraham Lincoln all the time, kind of being a little cultish and just being like, he's one of those people that use religion as an excuse. I mean, he was trying to find a religious podcast that gave him the cosign and be like, yep, it's okay to murder someone. Give me the green light to murder Cousineau. Like, you know, that shows you how deranged and unhinged he was already. But once again, Barry is the type of person that will use whatever he can to justify himself, which we see that with so many other characters in the series, whether it's a Fuchs, whether it's a NoHo Hank, whether it's a Sally, whether it's a Cousineau. Everyone's a victim of their own creation in some regards, especially that whole notion of doing and taking what you want to just to justify your own actions. Every character has been guilty to that to some shape or form, and Barry's probably one of the most obvious of that. The lengths he will go to justify his actions, and constantly reiterating this thing of like trying to be like, I'm not a bad guy, but it's like, you are, Barry. You're a bad guy trying to be good, and it happens for a while. Like I said, half the show you're pretty sympathetic for Barry. I mean, until he basically went on a killing spree at the end of season 2, where he ended up killing all of Hank and Cristoval's people. Well, most of Hank's people and like all of Cristoval's people. It's like, yo, that's where we start seeing the turn, and you see how that derangement and unhingedness carries over to 3, and it carries over to 4. Like, he has these little moments of humanity, but it's just like, Barry's all kinds of jacked up. And like I said, maybe the Albert situation, the aftermath of him killing an innocent dude who had nothing to do with shooting Albert, sent him over the edge, and that's why we got the Barry arc. Because once again, we never really got to know Barry pre all of this, pre, you know, being in the military. Like, and it's Hank was one of the first people to point it out to Barry. I mean, the audience could tell, but I think in universe, Hank was the first one to be like, you have major, massive rage issues. And he does. I mean, that's what sent him over the edge. But you also have to think about, too, like, Barry has this, like, twisted relationship of killing, because one of the, like, finding out he had a knack for it is when Albert and the guys were like, yo, Barry shot this guy from like 700 meters away or something like that. They were hyping him up, and like even he recognized like, that's kind of unhinged. I probably shouldn't, like, for class, I shouldn't like glorify like how hyped up it was. Like he, you know, even when he was typing out the story, he's like, yeah, that was the first time I killed someone. It was the best day of my life. He's like, no, backspace, delete that. That's crazy. But the fact is, Barry can't even tell later on when he is being crazy. At least season 1 and 2, he could tell, like, I messed up, I did something unhinged. But I mean, it's like I said, Barry's story's so interesting because of that line of, he was already kind of messed up. And like I said, the recognition he got for killing, like, that's why I think when Fuchs offers him the opportunity to become a hitman, he associates it with, oh, like, I was hyped up for, like, I am good at this. And once again, he's also justified in it because Fuchs did tell him we were taking out bad people. Doesn't make it right, but he's kind of, in his own mind, is like, well, I'm a good guy because I'm taking out bad people. It's not like I'm taking out good people, but that line starts to blur. Well, I mean, for one, you already did it in, you know, war, as Fuchs put it. It's like, oh, fog of war. But then he's like, what about the Janice of it all? You killed Janice out of self-preservation. Same thing for Chris. You killed Chris, you set it up like a suicide. Once again, not trying to make Fuchs out to be a good guy. He is a part of the problem, but like I said, it becomes that line of, you know, someone's manipulation versus personal responsibility. And a lot of times, Barry did not take personal responsibilities. It was always passing the buck off to someone else. Someone else is responsible for me. And yes, like I said, Fuchs played a big role in that, but at one point you have to start being like, it was me. I mean, the ending of the series, he wouldn't be dead. He could have gone off, been with Sally and his family. Well, Sally was telling him to turn himself in because Barry refused to ever take personal responsibility. And even when he tried to do the right thing, blew up in his face when Kusino killed him. To be fair, Kusino got blamed for everything. Like, everything that was on Barry, Kusino came out looking like the main villain. And Barry comes out looking like a selfless hero, at least in the movie. We don't know in the grand scheme of the world of Barry how he's viewed in general. Sally will know the truth. His son, debatable, you know, because what he saw as a kid, but he only saw some of it, versus what Sally told him in like the series finale. But like post the time skip, how much did he hear about his dad in those years, you know? Because we don't know, like, the public, what came up at trial when Gene was locked up. You know, we don't know stuff like that. But obviously for the movie to get made the way it was, but that's also playing into, well, movies always based on true events. It's not always a one-to-one. There's some stuff fudged for dramatic flair. So once again, we don't know how much is known publicly about Barry. I mean, the only person that's alive that really knows about Barry in general is Fuchs. Fuchs, the only person who knows the entire, well, him and Sally. But even, I don't know if Sally knows everything that Barry's done. Fuchs knows everything. So I think he's the only person that does know, like, every angle to the story. My point about this video was just talking about how interesting and a complicated character Barry is, despite being a bad guy. I've talked about it time and time again. I am that type of person that, like, roots for the bad guy, but I'm rooting because I know, like, oh, you're a bad guy. Like, there's a few bad guys, like, I'm like, a Homelander? Nah, fuck Homelander. I'm never rooting for a Homelander, but from a character point, you're like, oh my god, this is such a, like, so unhinged, complicated character, but I'm rooting for your downfall. I can't wait for you to get yours. You know, I know it's coming in the final season. We just don't know in what shape or form. But versus like a Walter White or a Raymond Reddington in The Blacklist, which Red's kind of a complicated thing because if you know where The Blacklist goes, you know there's a lot of layers to Red's situation. But I like someone who's a villain who is like, Red's a little more anti-hero-ish, even though he is straight up a villain. It's like, oh, I will kill people for my own self-preservation. I'm not a good guy, but I'm a bad guy who can do good. Versus like a Walter White where it's like, oh, I accepted Walt as a bad guy. He's a very self-indulgent, narcissistic, egotistical bad guy. But I was also like, kind of want you to get away with everything. Once again, that speaks more about me, but I'm also recognizing enough of like, oh, I'm not looking at him as like, oh my God, he's the hero. Very much like a Barry. Like, Barry has that same trajectory of like, you feel sympathetic. Walt started off with cancer. Barry, it's like he was manipulated into being a hitman. He wants to better himself. He does terrible things because he's just trying to protect the life he's building for himself, because he doesn't want to be that hitman anymore. He wants to be Barry Block, the actor. He doesn't want to be Barry Berkman, the hitman, anymore. But once again, you start pushing that goalpost more and more. Like, what are you willing to do? What are you capable of doing to protect what is yours? Once again, we see that more and more with other characters. And that also is kind of a thing about the show, too, is like how much of a negative effect Barry had on so many people's lives. There was good that came into people's lives, but overall, everyone's lives were so much more worse off because of Barry. So it becomes that, like I said, conversation of, I recognize Barry Berkman as a terrible guy and a bad guy. There was a part of me that's like, I kind of wanted him to get away, but I'm also at the same time like, it's poetic justice for him to, you know, ultimately catch the bullet in the head that he did. Because there were so many times and chances, like I said, especially in that final season, but in general, where Barry could have walked away. He had multiple opportunities, but once again, that rage, once he gets caught up in his mode of rage, he can't see anything, which we're all humans have that flaw of like, sometimes when we see red, we can't escape it. It's worse for others, for some than it is others. And Barry has shown, from as far as his backstory we could get, at least, like, you know, in the military, when he saw red, that's all he could see, and that was always that had the entire series, that was always his undoing, especially as the series progressed more and more, and him struggling with his identity of being who he was versus who he is versus who he wants to be. So I don't know, that just kind of like the antithesis of this entire video. And like I said, it just, I've been watching a lot of Barry stuff recently, and it just had it like recirculate in my mind of just like, man, I love the show. I love that character for being the terrible person that he is, and just how complicated it is, that how you are already kind of a monster in some ways, but you were sympathetic, but it becomes this thing of you become more twisted, you become more trying to justify your actions, and what kind of monster it turns you into in the end, that the monster you didn't want to be anymore, arguably you can make the argument that you became an even worse monster, because at the very least you could say, hey, you started off by just killing bad guys. That wasn't the case. There were some innocent and good people you killed along the way. So, and I think that adds to like that very like dark element to the comedy of it. It's like, oh, your life ended up being this dark comedic tragedy. But obviously these are just some of my thoughts. I'd love to get to know your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think of Barry Berkman as a character? Do you agree with some of my points? Do you disagree? Just in general, I'd love to know your feel and vibe about the character. Did you get everything you wanted from that character from the storytelling perspective of Barry? Or did you want more? Did you want less? Like, where were you at the beginning of the series versus where were you at the end, and so everywhere in between? Like, just let me know your emotions and your thoughts related to the character of Barry Berkman. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.